Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. And in this video, we're going to talk about lumbar dominance. Now, this is during the movement assessments that you'd be doing with folks, but it's sort of a general question. And I was asked by a student to kind of explain a little bit about lumbar dominance versus quad dominance versus gluteal dominance. Now, this, of course, is going to be something of importance or interest when you're not only studying to take your ACE exam, but of course, in the real world, you can actually look at somebody and make a determination as to what quote dominance they have when they do their squat. This is a critically important issue when it comes to actually training and dealing with the biomechanics of how your clients are doing properly, hopefully properly doing squats. But you're going to see this all the time. And so there are these three. ACE will give you three basic terms that they use, right? Lumbar dominance, right? And that's going to be this way or excessive overarching or excessive lordotic curve in the lower back, right? Quad dominance, where you don't get the appropriate hip hinging, right? So the torso doesn't lean forward enough, right, to kind of sit up a little bit higher, and that forces the feet, the knees to kind of move forward first during the initial movement pattern of the squat, or what's known as gluteal dominance. And the funny thing is that the term gluteal dominance is actually the proper way to do a squat. It's the way we teach people how to do squats is through what's known as gluteal dominance. Means that there's an appropriate forward lean. You're sitting the hips back initially, but I want to just kind of show this to you because the student had asked me, what should you do if a client's, feet, I think it was the legs or knees move forward. Okay, so got to be careful with this because as long as there is proper gluteal dominance, in other words, as long as there's a proper hip hinge, it's actually okay to have the knees move over the toes. I don't know if you've been in the game long enough, you've always been told don't allow the knees to go forward of the toes. Okay, well, that's like one of these general don't go any lower than parallel to the ground, right? These are the general vanilla flavored type of cues that you're supposed to give your clients. No, biomechanics are unique to your clients. Every client has a unique biomechanical scenario. A lot of it is based, particularly with squats, it's based on the length or the relative length of the femur compared to the length of the tibiofibular complex or the lower leg. In other words, how long is the upper leg to the lower leg, right? So upper leg, that's your knee right there, right? And what's the length difference? And depending on that ratio or the difference in comparative length differences, no, it might actually be really important for a tall person with a really long upper leg, short lower leg to have the knees go over the toes. Once again, as long as there's a proper hip hinge. And I want to show you that. And this is in chapter 10. Now, again, for the most part, if you're going through the chapter and you're just trying to study, obviously learn the assessments themselves. Let me go ahead and pull this up for you. Learn the assessments, right? The muscular assessments. And again, this is right here. You can see we're at page 432, 433. This, of course, is part of the assessment, right? The movement assessment component of chapter 10. Your main focus, by the way, just keep in mind, your main focus here is going to be memorizing these tables. But what I want to do today is direct your attention to page 432, because this for the most part answers the question that this one student had with respect to lumbar, quad, or glute dominance, and that is in the expand your knowledge. This is really designed to help you to understand something in the real world. In general, I don't normally recommend from a studying perspective, especially if you don't have a whole lot of time to study. I don't normally recommend that you read and try to quote memorize the expand your knowledge boxes, but they are very helpful from a real world perspective. And in this case, especially in today's video, these two right here, this expand your knowledge and this expand your knowledge, ACE actually, they really hit, dead center on this, because for the most part, people are not, they don't do squats. Number one, they don't do them correctly. And they also use some old, outdated information, i.e., don't let the knees go over the toes. But again, that's, it's like they say, a little bit of information is dangerous. Sure, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, when a client's knees track forward of the toes during a squat, it's because of a particular issue known as quadriceps dominance. And I'm going to start there. For the most part, quadriceps dominance simply means that the client, the individual, does not allow their torso, and take a look at this. This is a perfect example. Does not allow the torso to lean forward enough. Look, when you do a squat, proper squatting movements, just think about when you go to sit down in a chair. You sit in your car. Anything where you are going to sit down, what do you normally do first? You lean your torso forward. That's the proper, biomechanically, it makes the most sense. Because we are bipedal animals, we have this very interesting, unique biomechanical issue of trying to get from a standing position to a seated or squatted position. And that occurs primarily, or initially, right, primarily is going to occur first at the pelvis. Okay. And if you look, you can go through chapter 10 here. You can go through this entire textbook. They got some great pictures, but this one right here gives you a real good summation of what is supposed to happen. Quadricep dominance, if you read the copy here on this page, basically says that the individual is not going to allow, or is not going to move into or allow for this proper, what's known as a hip hinge. And that's what this all comes down to. When I tell my clients to do a squat, the first thing I say is, first and foremost, put your body weight on your heels. What does that do? It immediately forces you to move your hips back, right? And you'll notice that, especially in this picture, you'll notice the hips have sort of moved from this position, right, to here. The hips moved backwards. And that is the initiating position for a squat, is what we call the hip hinge. So basically the pelvis itself turns, right, anteriorly. And we talk about anterior pelvic tilt, meaning the superior, or the top part of the pelvis moves forward, right, to the front, right? And as long as that rotation occurs like this, that's called anterior pelvic tilting. Now, as long as that happens under controlled conditions, you are doing the ideal, or what we call gluteal dominant position. So quad dominance means that pelvis is not tilting forward. In other words, the individual tries to maintain an upright posture, right? And instead of moving forward, they just actually try to move down. And what happens, of course, at that point is where we see the most common improper technique. Was that's when you'll see the knees move in front of the toes. In that case, that's not good. Okay, we don't want that to happen. I'll give you a great example is when you do front squats. I don't know if you've ever done front squats before, but you do squats with the weight behind you, just as a, for instance, if you're using a bar, or you can put them in front of you where you put your arms up, bar goes. When you do it, a front squat, you are maintaining a more upright torso position. But in that case, that's not an issue. Okay, that's not an issue. The issue is when the appropriate lean forward, or the appropriate hip hinge, is not initiated. Okay, even on a front squat, just as an example, even on a front squat, the initial movement is always going to be slight bend at the knee, just a slight bend at the knee, but then immediately the hips move backward. Hope that makes sense. So quadricep dominance simply means that the hips ain't moving backwards, right? The person is trying to go straight down. Generally, we'll see a lack of appropriate lordosis, or the lordotic curve. You got to maintain a lordotic curve in the lower back when you do squats. And quite often with quad dominance, we see just the opposite. We see sort of a rounding of the lower back, and that's what pushes the feet and the legs forward. It's almost as if all the weight of your body is leaning forward on the toes. So that kind of answers the question for the student that basically asked this question of what do you do when a client is quad dominant? So the answer to the question is really simple. You give them a slap in the head. No, don't do that. You tell them to move their hips back. Now, I'll be honest with you. I don't know any client that I've ever done this with that doesn't immediately shift their body weight onto their heels and get their hips back. That's all I have to tell them to do. It's really that simple. So the compensation, the appropriate biomechanical compensation is really pretty simple. When I see a client going down and they're not leaning forward, I don't tell them to lean their torso forward, because guess what they'll do? They'll collapse their rib cage. Does that make sense? No, I don't tell them to lean forward. I don't have to. All I tell them to do is sit your hips back behind you and put your weight on your heels. And the torso immediately moves into an appropriate hip hinge. For the most part, the average client, and again, I don't know any client where this doesn't work. It's really that simple. So that's quadricep. It's quadricep dominance. You, of course, can have individuals try this, and you can even tell them, go put your weight on your toes and see what happens. I've done that with clients, to help them to feel the difference between feeling it in their quads when they do the exercise versus this quad dominance. Go ahead and lean forward on your toes. And they go, oh, that doesn't feel right. Yeah, of course it doesn't. But if you sit your weight back on your heels, quad dominant folks, sit the weight back on the heels, sit the hips back. And as soon as they do that, they have to compensate for the hips moving back by moving the torso in a hip hinge position, move the torso forward to compensate now for what I just cued them to do, which is to sit the hips back, put the weight on your heels. Try it yourself. Put the video on pause, stand up and try doing it. Put all the weight on your toes. You'll feel your knees come forward, and then it will hurt your knees. Okay, so that is quad dominance. So quad dominance is one thing, right? And then there is let's go to lumbar dominance. Okay, so lumbar dominance is really pretty straightforward. That's where the lumbar spine itself is overarched. Now, in this picture right here, you can see that's kind of an ideal scenario. She's kind of got that pretty much pegged properly, where there is a normal. Let me repeat that: a normal arch in the lower back. Now, let me just take an aside for you. If you're using a lot of weight and you're doing heavy, and this just generally doesn't apply, but if you are and you're training an athlete, whatever the case is, you actually do want to provide a really strong, tight lumbar lower back, right? Lumbar spine. You need to tighten those erector spinae muscles simply to ensure that, again, heavier loads are going to demand that the torso and the core are very, very tight. But again, for the assessment, like we're talking about here, or for the average client, just maintaining a normal lordotic curve is appropriate. I'll give you another little tip. Do not use the word neutral. I hate that term when it comes to the lower back. A neutral spine. Okay, there's no such thing as a neutral spine. The human spinal column, properly defined, has an S curve to it, which means that there is a lumbaric lordotic curve. The concept of neutral is very ineffective. I never use the word neutral spine with anybody. Okay, it's always either maintaining a normal lordotic curve, right? Normal curve in the lower back with the erector spinae tightened and abdominals tightened, or if you're going to do abdominal training, just as a for instance, you're going to actually reduce the lordotic curve to allow the abdominals to flex the spinal column. Point is that what you're seeing here in this picture is a normal lordotic curve, and that's going to be worked with that hip hinge. So whenever the hip hinge is initiated, the normal curve in the lower back should be maintained. Now, what is lumbar dominance then? It's when that is over exaggerated. And keep in mind, both lumbar dominance and quad dominance are generally caused by, and that's where you can go back to your key suspected compensations, okay? Normally caused by, take a look over here, because on table 1016, what do you notice? Lumbar dominance, okay? And that's usually caused by what? These guys right here. These are the issues you're going to face. That's why it's happening. Now, the question is though, how do you help somebody? Well, we know what the modalities are going to be initiated to help somebody. You got to stretch them, you do the foam rolling, you do all the other different things. You got to strengthen, right? Strengthen the lengthen or underactive, right? And stretch and do, again, foam rolling on those shortened or tightened muscles. Now, again, ACE uses some different terminology. They're going to throw hypertonic at you, hypertonic, shortened, overactive. They all, for the most part, mean the same thing. A muscle that is inappropriately shortened is overactive, meaning it's receiving a higher than normal action potential stimulus. And so the muscle shortens more than it should under normal conditions. We also call that hypertonic because tonus simply means the sort of the regulatory level of contraction that a muscle has when it's not under loaded conditions. We call that tonus. And so if it's hyper, well, then it's going to tighten up and shorten a little bit. And that's the terminology that they're using. So back to our information here. So lumbar dominance, you can tell, well, I should correct myself. You can't normally tell lumbar dominance because for the most part, if a person has a normal, right, sort of lordotic, their normal lordotic curve is quote excessive, but that's normal for them. It might appear to be lumbar dominant. Well, how do you know? Well, for the most part, you can get a kind of a rough idea by how much they are able to move into that hip hinge position. And again, ACE will tell you or give you some compensation techniques, things to look at. But this is it's an art when you're really doing this with folks. I've known folks that basically walk in and their normal posture is whoosh, this incredible lordotic curve. Well, for them, that's normal. Other folks come in and their lordotic curve is not as prominent. And so I would have to be careful when I make an assessment like that. So that's lumbar dominance. Of course, the key here is that we're looking for what's known as glute dominance, gluteal dominance. And if the glutes are, at their proper length and they have normal strength ratios between the glutes, of course, and the hip flexors, which are antagonistic muscle groups, if all of that is good, then generally what you're going to find is that the individual can lean forward from the pelvis, not from spinal flexion. Remember, it's hip flexion. That's what the hip hinge is. It's hip flexion. See where I'm pointing is the hip, not the spine. Okay. When the difference, of course, you can see from the side is simply going to be the collapsing of the rib cage, protraction of the shoulder girdle. That is not what we're looking for, especially in an assessment like this. But in gluteal dominance, I guess the question is why even put the word dominance in it? That's the normal way you're supposed to do a squat, but it's gluteal dominant because the glutes are the initial activators, like I say, to initiate a squat. The knees are bent slightly. Cue your client to put the weight, kind of shift the weight onto their heel a little bit, right? And then hip hinge, which means hips go back. As long as the hips go back and the weight is on their heels, they will simply move from this position, boom, right to this position in some way, shape, or form. And that's going to begin the process of the squat. Now, of course, from there, obviously now, as the individual goes down, then there will be the significant knee extension, or excuse me, knee flexion that will allow the torso to move down. And you'll look at the ankle, of course. You look at the knee from the front, from the side for the assessment itself. But this I hope answers the question that that the student had with respect to, you know, exactly how do you deal with or cue a client who, for the most part, is what we call quad dominant. And so the answer to that, like I said, is that the cue is really simple. Put the weight on your heel, sit your hips back, boom, they're going to just lean forward because they're going to lose their balance. And so that's how you would deal with it. If they're gluteal dominant, they're perfect. Normally, everything is good. Just head position, you got to watch out for shoulder position, rib cage lifted. If they are lumbar dominant, that can be a problem because of the excessive curvature in the lower back. And then just keep in mind, of course, the tables themselves. In this particular case, table 1016, I think it is. Look at the overactive and the underactive muscles to help with the memorization itself. But do it on yourself. Think about it, or have somebody that, you know, by the way, just from a purely memorization perspective with a lot of this material, if you have somebody that you can actually do this with and do the assessment on, not just reading and rewriting it, but actually working with somebody, it's going to be very, very helpful. But when you're doing that, do not, let's see if I get this straight. Do not do the reading and rewriting, because again, even if you're a tactile learner, looking at somebody and going, okay, do this. Oh, I get it now. Guess what? You still have to memorize. You still have to memorize the over and underactive muscles that are involved with that. That involves reading and writing. By the way, I can look at somebody, I can go, okay, hang on there for 1 second. What is the overactive right now? And then I can write that down. But it's the reading it, rewriting it, looking at it, use all the different modalities of learning that you have at your disposal. And again, if you've got 3 months to take your exam, you can spend a lot of time on this particular area. If you've only got 3 weeks to do it, you're going to hone in and focus on the tables. But I hope this answers any other questions that you may have, because if you do have more questions, just put them in the comment section below. If you do want more in-depth explanation of all the chapters in the ACE 6th edition, click on the link below for our exam prep. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our channel. Make sure you hit the notification bell so you know when all the information is coming out. And by the way, if you have not done so, go check out our Facebook group that is specific for the ACE exam. It's designed to help you with other students. We have over 10,000 folks, members in that group right now. And all of them are doing basically what you're trying to do, which is to pass the ACE exam on the first go around, or wherever you're at. If you've taken it before, then for sure we would like to help you to pass it on the next attempt that you're doing. If you have any questions, please reach out. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week. Thanks.